Welcome to our second lesson on photosynthesis. Today we'll take a close look at the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. Before we begin, let's get back to basics. Here is the photosynthesis equation. We know photosynthesis begins with carbon dioxide and water. Those are our reactants, and the energy from the sun is used to transform these reactants into these products: glucose, which is sugar, and oxygen. So that's the overall process that's taking place. And last time we even learned that photosynthesis happens in two sets of reactions: the light-dependent reactions, which need light, and the light-independent reactions, which do not. So today we're going to look at this half, the light-dependent reactions. They take place inside of the thylakoids, which are those Mentos-like little discs, and they absolutely require energy from sunlight to split water, and oxygen comes out, and somehow magically our NADP plus is reduced into NADPH, and our ADP is going to be phosphorylated into ATP. We'll end up with these two molecules that are really important for the light-independent reactions. And today we're going to see exactly how this happens, how these light-dependent reactions happen. Before we do that, I want to let you know that we're going to zoom into a single thylakoid and see what's inside that thylakoid, because that's where the light-dependent reactions happen. We know the thylakoids are filled with chlorophyll, but what exactly is their arrangement and structure, and how does this all happen? So here we are right now inside of a thylakoid, and in there we find these light harvesting complexes. There are those neon green discs with the perforated edges right here. And what they do is they take in light and they bounce it from each other back and forth, the way volleyball players would bounce the ball, or a pinball machine would bounce the ball back and forth, until that light hits one of these green discs. This is known as a photosystem, and it's super important because this is where the light-dependent reactions take place, and this is where photosynthesis begins. Okay, so it turns out that the photosystems come in two types: photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Photosystem 1 is so named because it was discovered first, and photosystem 2 got its name from being discovered second. Super original. So let's take a look at what happens in those light-dependent reactions. So light-dependent reactions have two pathways, and the first is the non-cyclic pathway, and this is the pathway we are really going to look at in great detail, and it's the pathway that you will need to know in great detail. The cyclic pathway, we will touch upon and look at it, but we don't necessarily need to know every little part of the cyclic pathways, because the non-cyclic is more common and it's going to be more important for our purposes. So the non-cyclic pathway has a lot of steps because it's complicated, but we're going to tackle it a little bit at a time. So the first thing that's going to happen when we look at this is we're going to move into one of these thylakoids. So this here, we're inside of a thylakoid compartment. And what happens is light is going to enter photosystem 2. So here's photosystem 2, here's photosystem 2. Light is actually entering both at the same time, but we're going to start somewhere so that this process makes sense. So light enters photosystem 2, and that light energy is going to excite these electrons. See how excited that electron is? It's jumping up to a higher state. And those excited electrons are going to be expelled from photosystem 2. They're going to be pushed out, the same way a teacher is going to send a really misbehaved, jumpy child out of the classroom. That never happens with us, but in theory. So these electrons are expelled from photosystem 2. But the problem is photosystem 2 is like, well, now I don't have any electrons. I need replacement electrons. So it's going to pull those electrons out of water. And in that process, it's going to break apart the water molecule into its components, the hydrogen and the oxygen. The oxygen is going to be sent out entirely from the leaf, and that's why plants make oxygen during photosynthesis. And that oxygen can then be used by you and me. We could breathe it in and do some cellular respiration. The hydrogen ions stay inside of the thylakoid, and they're going to start getting built up to higher levels, and we'll touch on this more later. So that's step 1 and 2. Later, we were talking about these, actually not later, but next, these electrons that were pushed out of photosystem 2 enter what is known as an electron transfer chain. Basically, they're being bounced from one molecule to the next, and they're losing energy in that process. The energy that's being lost is actually used to do work. And the work that's being done here is we are taking more of these hydrogen ions and we are actively pumping them into the thylakoid. They don't really want to go there because it's pretty cramped inside of the thylakoid, but they are being pumped into there using energy from the electrons. And why that's happening, we'll discuss that later. But in the meantime, what we see happen is our electrons have lost energy and they reach photosystem 1. Okay, so here we are at photosystem 1, and what's going to happen is light energy is hitting photosystem 1, and that's going to cause those electrons to become excited, and they're going to be expelled from photosystem 1. And anytime photosystem 1 is running low on its electrons, it gets more from this electron transport chain, which came from photosystem 2. Okay, so these electrons enter a second electron transfer chain right here, and they're being passed along. And their energy is not being used to pump hydrogen ions this time. Their energy is actually used to make NADPH. If you remember from our last lesson, NADP plus is needed, and we're going to add the electrons, and we're going to add some hydrogen, and we're going to make NADPH. And that's awesome because that's something we need for the light-independent reaction. So we got something that we needed. We have the NADPH. After this point, we're at step 7. We're going to go back to and talk about these hydrogen ions. So what we've done is built up a lot of hydrogen ions inside of the thylakoid, and there's fewer hydrogen ions on the outside. So basically, there's a higher concentration inside than outside. So these hydrogen ions want to go down their concentration gradient. They want to get out. It's kind of like when you and your friend, not your friends, strangers, okay, people you don't want to be near, you're all cramped into an elevator. The second the doors open, people get out and they try to spread out from each other. You don't walk around in a big clump. That's what the hydrogen ions do. They can't wait to get out of the thylakoid. And they do get out of the thylakoid. Right here is a passageway for them. And that passageway is through something known as ATP synthase. And ATP synthase is an enzyme. And as the hydrogens pass through ATP synthase, that energy is going to be used to phosphorylate our ATP, to change our ADP into ATP, because that's the second thing that we need for the light-independent reactions. So that is the non-cyclic pathway. And here is a nice summary of what's happening. We are going from ADP and a phosphate group, and we are ending up with ATP. We are going from NADP plus to the reduced version, NADPH, and our water has been split and we were left with oxygen. So these are the outcomes of the non-cyclic pathway. Okay? The other pathway is the cyclic pathway. Now this pathway is the one that you don't need to know in great detail as you do the other pathway. It's simpler, however, and it only uses photosystem 1. So it turns out that photosystem 2 evolved later and photosystem 1 evolved first. And even plants that have both photosystems don't always use both. They can just use photosystem 1. So plants actually don't need as much NADPH as they need ATP. They need more ATP. So sometimes they don't need to make NADPH. And at those times, they're going to use the cyclic pathway. Basically what happens here is we don't use this at all. There's an X here, no photosystem 2. But photosystem 1 is going to be helping to make that ATP. And whenever photosystem 1 runs out of electrons, it can't get them from photosystem 2. So it's actually going to loop back. Like these electrons will loop back and replenish photosystem 1. That's why it's called a cyclic pathway. Okay, and here you can see the summary of it. No NADPH being made, no oxygen being released. This pathway is just going to take ADP and give us ATP. And this is the cyclic pathway. It's not used. You can't get to the Calvin cycle from here. It can't be used to make sugar because you need the NADPH for that. But sometimes plants just need some ATP. Okay, so here is a nice summary of the light-dependent reactions. Back to the simpler picture, right? So we have now seen that light was being used in the thylakoid. We saw into the thylakoid. We saw those photosystems, photosystem 1 and 2. We saw how water was being broken apart, its electrons taken, and we were left with oxygen. And we also saw how ADP was being changed into ATP, and we saw how NADP plus was being changed to NADPH. And now we have our light-dependent reactions. Next time we can take a look at the light-independent reactions. But before we go there, I feel like we've worked very hard. We deserve to see what the point of all this photosynthesis stuff is, why it's so complicated. So I'm going to show you a little video, because without photosynthesis, this would not be possible. You have this lovely plant here, and it's growing, and it's a nice time lapse of a plant, and you can just watch it, wash away your photosynthesis stress. Just observe the process. And it's a little long, so I might go forward a bit. Look at those light-dependent reactions at work, together with the light-independent reactions, allowing the plant to increase its biomass and grow and develop. And you might be able to see what's growing here. There it is. You might already suspect what kind of plant this is, but I'm not going to give it away. By the way, this video was put up by YouTube user HPIECE, and it was shot with a GoPro Hero 4. And soon this will be the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to practice. There it is, beautiful pumpkin. Be sure to practice and study these reactions. Thank you for watching.